So we've considered different forms of government intervention to try and solve markets which are failing, specifically environmental markets which are failing. But as we know, any time the government intervenes in the market, there's a chance it can fail as well, okay? And that's a disastrous scenario to find ourselves in. So that's a great way to evaluate. Anytime we're looking at government intervention, always bring in government failure, because there's a good likelihood that this could actually happen. So, what is the definition of government failure? So this is important, this is the official definition. Government failure occurs when the cost of intervention outweighs the benefits that occur because of the intervention itself. As a result, there's a misallocation of resources and a further loss of economic and social welfare. So that's the official definition of government failure, when the cost of intervention outweighs the benefit that it brings. Okay? And there are four key ways the government can fail. Okay? Number one, is when the admin costs are high. Okay? But specifically, very high. Okay? And the costs are more than the benefits that come along. So, good example of this, we've talked about regulatory bodies like Ofgem and Ofcom, the Competition Commission, the Office of Fair Trading. These are all government kind of set up departments to regulate markets which are being abused, monopoly markets and things. But to actually keep these running are very, very expensive. And the costs are extremely high in doing so. And we can make a case that actually the costs are higher than the benefits that come about because of them. If that's the case, well then we have government failure. And all times the government intervenes, there are very, very high admin costs. Any time it intervenes on whatever market failure. So we can always use that to evaluate, and that's quite a good one. So admin costs to be very high. The second one, which we can always talk about, is information problems. Okay, information problems, another one we can always use. If we've got information problems in the market, and if economic agents don't have full information, then why all of a sudden will governments have full information when they intervene? Obviously they're not going to have full information, are they? So if they have information problems too, then the decisions that they make might not be the most efficient ones. And in fact, they might make decisions that actually make things worse. Okay, so for example, with environmental market failure, a lot of the times the government intervenes, it needs to know what the socially optimum level of pollution is. But how can it know? It doesn't have a clue. So actually getting to the socially optimum might not actually occur. In fact, we could be making things worse by trying to get there in the first place. Okay? So we know with property rights and things, it might not necessarily work because of information problems on both sides, economic agents and with the government too. And that's the case why we could be doing more damage than good. The third one is unintended consequences. So by the government intervening in a market, by trying to solve something, it actually makes something else worse. Something unintended happens, and that's a consequence. So for example, by the government regulating the amount of fishermen can catch from the sea or from a lake or from a river or something, we can have unintended consequences. How could that work? Well, if the fisherman knows he's only allowed to catch a certain number of fish, well, it might mean that he catches a lot of fish, realises he's caught more than that's allowed, and then he throws dead fish back into the sea, thus making things worse than they were before. Okay, dead fish are no good to anybody. They go back into the sea. Well, that's an unintended consequence. So by trying to solve the problem of overfishing, we can actually see unintended consequences as a result. Okay, so throwing dead fish back into the sea, not good. Another key one we can look at with unintended consequences is when it comes to pollution again. Okay, so look at geographical pollution problems. So the government trying to regulate pollution in a certain economy. Well, if it's the only one that does that, okay, it might mean that firms relocate elsewhere where regulation isn't so strong. And if that's the case, well, geographical pollution could actually be worse in a certain area. Okay, and potentially the problem with pollution could actually be worse as a result. So that's an unintended consequence too. Another time we can look at it, taxation, for a similar reason. By the government taxing a hell of a lot in one country, it might mean firms relocate to countries where taxation is less. Therefore, firms leave the country, it's bad for the economy. Unintended consequence. And that's another problem we have, and a potential source of government failure. Okay, and the last one is a conflict of objectives. So this is another source of government failure. So conflict of objectives. So the government intervening in the market actually conflicts another objective. So let's look at the example of, again, pollution, okay? And we'll look at the case of regulation this time. So if we look at regulation in natural monopoly markets like the gas market, the key reason for regulation in those markets is to make prices more competitive, to stop this abuse of the monopoly. So the whole point there is to bring prices down. But we all know to produce gas creates a negative externality. So environmentalists will say, well actually, we need to be charging a higher price to reduce the level of output. So we've got conflicting objectives there. The government wants to reduce price to make it more competitive, but at the same time, society seems to want the prices to be higher to reflect the negative externality in the production. So here we go, a conflict of objectives there. We've got problems, don't we? At the same time, we've got this problem of regulatory capture. So by setting up a regulatory authority, we can have a conflict of objectives if that regulatory body actually forms a close relationship with a firm, with a natural monopoly, a monopoly, an abusive firm. Okay, if that happens, well, the government's objective is actually for prices to be competitive, okay, for firms to act in their best interest, for regulatory bodies to stop kind of the abusive firms. But if we have regulatory capture, we might just go the complete opposite way. And in fact, introducing regulatory bodies might have no effect. In fact, it could make things worse. So conflict of objectives is another source of government failure. So these are all things where we can evaluate. Anytime we talk about government intervention in the market, you should always mention government failure. And try and think of examples for each one of these four, like I've just done, and use it in your essays that way. That'll be really good. I'm also going to put up a video linking to a question answered by Milton Friedman about market failure and how the government tries to solve it. And he talks very nicely about how any time a government intervenes, there's always going to be government failure because of the problems involved in the market in the first place. The government's not going to do any better in trying to solve it. So I'll put that video, the link to the video, in the description of this one. Okay, I'll do one more video on merit goods, and that'll be it for market failure. Thank you.